Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Breakfast Club. We're so glad that you're with us today. It's been a while, so this is fun for me personally too. Today, though, is really special because we're going to be talking about COVID-19 and kids, and specifically the COVID vaccine for kids 5 to 11, but really all kinds of topics specific to caring for and worrying about kids in the age of COVID. It's something so many of you wrote in with questions about. So we are really, really grateful to be welcoming two guests that are able to speak to those questions today. One, which is the Academy's own Chief of Science, Dr. Shannon Bennett. But our very special guest today is Dr. Diana Bojorquez, who is, I'm going to read your title properly here, Assistant Physician and Chief of Pediatrics for Kaiser Permanente San Francisco. Diana, thank you so much for being here. And Shannon, thanks so much for coming back.
Thank you for the invite.
You're welcome, and thank you.
Yeah, and thanks to all of you who wrote in with questions for our guests today. We have a whole lineup of them prepared, but also if you're watching live, you are welcome to put your questions in the chat if you're watching on YouTube, or in comments if you're watching on Facebook, anytime at all, and we will try to work those in where we can. So we're going to dive right in because we've got a really good selection of stuff to speak to today. And as always, just so that you can get to know our guests a little bit better, we are going to ask each of them to start with a brief intro. And Dr. Bojorquez, let's start with you. I'm going to give you your slides in just a moment. Shannon, we'll see you in a second.
Thank you, Laurel, for the invite. Such a pleasure to be here. Yeah, so a little bit about myself. I am born and raised in Southern California. And my parents immigrated from Mexico, like so many of our immigrant families, just to look for more opportunities, give a better life for their family. I am one of four, and all of us had the opportunity to go to Cal State Fullerton, had an amazing education there. And it was there where I first even considered the opportunity of getting a medical degree, and much even more exciting, being able to get it from Yale. So I did 4 wonderful years at Cal State Fullerton, got my bachelor's, and met an amazing mentor along the way that encouraged me to get involved in research, as well as just consider other opportunities. From there, I made the big move, went all the way across the country, even though in my family it was not okay to move before being married, but we did it. I did 4 great years at Yale, got my medical degree, also got involved in research in pediatric pathology, actually. Had a wonderful mentor there. But after 4 years, decided I needed to come back to California. So I came back to San Francisco, did my residency at UCSF, and then I did chief residency year at the Zuckerberg. Back then it was just called the General. And after that, I came and joined Kaiser Permanente, where I am now in my 15th year. And I'm so grateful for the opportunities that Kaiser's provided. Not only do I have a busy general pediatrics practice, but I also have gotten involved in a lot of leadership roles. And as you mentioned, assistant physician in chief, I oversee pediatrics. I also oversee our physician health and wellness programs, as well as our equity, inclusion, and diversity and volunteerism. And through that, I'm very proud of the work that Kaiser Permanente has been able to do, particularly during this pandemic, where early on, we did realize the impact that COVID was having, particularly on our communities of color. And so, Laurel, if you'll bring up slide 11, we know that COVID has just had a disproportionate impact on our communities of color. Our death rate for our Latinx community is 19% higher and 16% higher in our Black community. So because of this, we have been able to partner with San Francisco Department of Public Health and have been focusing on communities where the impact has been disproportionately higher, both economically, you think about, as well as with medical burden, and work with our physicians to go out there to these communities, people that they trust, to talk about vaccine confidence. So thank you for the invitation again to do this today. And Kaiser Permanente has also been working with a lot of our community-based organizations to get out there. We can go back to slide 3, just to highlight some of the work, been able to work with a Latino task force. We've done also some podcasts on Instagram with their Calle 24. So just some wonderful work. And as well with Kaiser Permanente, being able to have the vaccine center with the city at the Moscone Center. Just great work. So super grateful to be here. Thank you.
Oh, we're so glad to have you. And I'm so glad you said go back to slide 3, because I was like, oh no, we missed the adorable baby.
Yes, it's just such great opportunity to take care of our families. And it's an honor, right? Like, parents trust me with what's most precious to them, and they allow me to enter their families. So we've been doing a lot of talk around how to keep our families safe during this pandemic. So hopefully we'll get to some of your questions today as well.
I know people are just so grateful to have you on today to get a firsthand account of what you're actually seeing as someone who cares for kids in a hospital and medical environment every day. And I think with all the sources of information out there, the questions that came in are very much like, please tell us the reality of what you're actually seeing as someone in this work. So thank you again for being here. I'm going to welcome Shannon back on, and Dr. Bojorquez, we'll see you in just a moment. And Shannon, your slides are here.
Great. Are they showing up okay? They look
yeah.
present. Great.
Okay.
Well, I'm also very, very excited to be here, and I'm so excited to hear from more from you, Deanna. It's so wonderful to meet you and hear about your work. I am a Canadian. I grew up in the East Coast in the Maritime provinces, but then did my undergrad at McGill University in Montreal, Quebec. And then I later did my graduate degree at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. But it was a real seminal moment for me when I was an undergraduate at McGill that I did a summer program. I went to Liberia, West Africa. I was very interested in biodiversity, in nature, in the great outdoors, but I hadn't honed in on what I wanted to do for my career. And so I went to West Africa, and I volunteered in a summer program where I was running a theater program with students of a local school in Liberia. And we would co-create skits together. Most of them were around primary health care, a lot around vaccines and explaining what vaccines were all about. Because I was the white person, I always got to play the pig if there was a public health message involving a pig. But it was a lot of fun. And I taught grade 5 math during the day. And what really impressed me about this experience was not only the incredible people that I got to work with, and the incredible health burdens and the resilience of these folk was, I showed up as a 19-year-old. Within weeks, I'd gotten malaria, amoebic dysentery, a staph infection. I was hospitalized in a leper colony. There's a long story here, but it was really a transformative to realize how resilient these communities were to ongoing disease burden, and for me to think about how different disease agents were evolving all the time and breaking down defenses and overcoming our immune system tools, our other public health tools to mitigate them, including vaccines. And I just decided that I wanted to come back and dedicate my scientific career to studying parasitism, the major features of parasitism, how parasites get around in natural systems, and how they emerge into new host communities of humans and human domesticated animals and other human aspects of society. So I've been when I went to University of British Columbia, my focus was on parasites, and then I did a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Texas in Austin, and then I went to Puerto Rico, and was at that time that I really started to focus on viruses. So viruses are the ultimate jumpers from natural systems into new hosts. They capture new hosts. They can capture new habitats when the opportunity arises, and it's because they're so fast evolving. So this is an image of me working in the field to collect mosquitoes. And my daughter, who's now 16, is fishing mosquito larvae out of an abandoned toilet in a forest in Hawaii. But we study mosquitoes all over the world, and then we take their little red blood-filled ruby-like bodies, and we bring them into the laboratory on the right, and we crack them open, and we look at the genetic information housed in the mosquito about the viruses that it might carry. So it's an incredible a discovery tool. It's like a little flying hypodermic needle sampling complex natural systems for us and bringing those viruses back into the lab where we can look at their genetic makeup and understand what makes them tick and evaluate their potential for jumping into new hosts. And so I've been working mostly on a lot of mosquito-borne diseases. These are family trees of dengue, chikungunya, Zika, and in so many cases we can root them in natural systems. Those are the blocks of pink. And then we can chart as the family tree evolves which major changes happen to facilitate the jump into humans. And those there's not one single answer, right? We think about the coronavirus family tree, and we ask what are the major mutations that drove it from natural systems in bats to be so efficient in humans. And it's a lot of different changes across the genome. But a lot of them, similar to here, are concentrated in how the virus binds with the host cell. So host cell interactions, how it replicates within different kinds of cells, like mosquito transmissibility, mosquito cells versus vertebrate cells, not for COVID, but for these guys. And also viruses that become fine-tuned through the evolutionary process to be more transmissible. So very similar questions and patterns that we're seeing play out in coronavirus evolution. So I feel like this is a really important moment where we are building a collective understanding of where emerging viruses come from and how they evolve to make waves in the human populations, literal and figurative waves. So I'm really happy to be here, and thank you, everybody.
Thanks so much, Shannon. We are, so glad you're here. And I always love that story about you as a young person just getting sicker and sicker and being like, this is fascinating, though. It's really the birth of a scientist. And also, like, I remember the day that you taught me that there are species of viruses, and these are these living things that are, doing things in response to the environment. Fascinating. All right. Welcome back, Dr. Bojorquez, and let's dive in with some questions from our viewers. And I'm going to direct them at you each individually to start, but please know, like, if you have more to add, jump in. All perspectives are like, make just every answer better. So for starters, Shannon from Christine R. Vaccines for kids are still EAU. As a parent, how can I let my child get a vaccine that doesn't have full FDA approval yet? And will you start by just defining EAU for folks too?
Sure. So EAU is emergency use authorization. It's not always a step in vaccine development. It's usually only put in place as an authorization step when the societal need is urgent and the risk is very great. And so just before we start in to some of the things I want to share, I have a 16-year-old daughter. She was fully vaccinated starting the minute I was able to. So while the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine was still under EAU, emergency use authorization, and not fully approved. So I embraced that opportunity for my child, knowing that EAU, and that was back in May. She was fully vaccinated in May. So well before the full FDA authorization for the Pfizer BioNTech in August of 2021. So I get it. It's a decision that I made and embraced because the vaccine is so safe. And so we ask what's the difference between EUA and full vaccination. So for the FDA to give full approval, they're looking at three major types of information. The first and most important, arguably, is the safety and efficacy of the vaccine. So the safety, and then is it effective? So there's no point, even if it's safe, of using it if it's not effective enough, right? And then the two other kinds of data they look at is the risks and benefits. So once they know the safety and the efficacy, then they can continue to accrue more and more data to then translate that into risk and benefit from a public health standpoint. And knowing that vaccines are expensive and public health measures are expensive. And then the final thing is that they evaluate process, manufacturing process, to make sure that the quality is held up across time and over different manufacturing processes and facilities, including scalable. So emergency use authorization tackles the safety and efficacy first and foremost. So if it's given EAU approval, it's already gone through that full and rigorous evaluation of safety and efficacy. And the FDA insisted on at least 2 months of data following the start of these vaccine trials and the full vaccination program to make sure that these were safe. And in every vaccine our society has ever dealt with, the major problems come up within the first 2 months, if there is any problems. And so that was determined to be, so once those 2 months had passed and the data came in, it was evident that it was safe and effective enough to give EAU authorization. And now it's really just a matter of time before things get moved into full FDA approval. And if you remember, full FDA approval for Pfizer went in August, but it's really a matter of time to accumulate the data on and analyze as a society the risk and benefit. So the data is still accruing. The safety and efficacy is known and strong, but the rest of it is still coming in, especially for the younger age groups that started later, right? We weren't giving them vaccines at the same as early as we were giving to 18 and over. So now we have the Pfizer is fully approved with full FDA approval for a 16 and up, and it's EAU. So it's the same vaccine. We're just waiting for more time to pass. It's emergency authorization, emergency use authorized in children under 16, actually from 5 and up. And we're just waiting for the time to graduate it into full approval.
That's okay. That's really helpful. Did you want the, was there a map that you wanted to show now? Or?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let me put that up.
So yeah, I was going to show this map and you can just kind of see how this is the 12 and up vaccination of fully vaccinated individuals across the U.S. and by county and by state. And so you can definitely see different patterns, and there's been analyses that look at hospitalization rates in children against this landscape, and definitely see it go up in places where vaccination rate of children is low. I also wanted to acknowledge that when you as an individual for your own children think about risk, you want to know what the safety of the vaccine is, but you also want to evaluate the safety of or the risk of getting COVID. And there's no question that getting COVID is far more dangerous, enormously more dangerous compared to getting the vaccine. And I do think I wanted to show slide number 3, which is COVID-19 hospitalizations by age. And so this just came out from the CDC, and the different ages are color coded. And this is a graph in a slide, so you can't really see it. But if you go to that link, you can actually follow and float over the different color bands. And if you float over the very young color band of 0 to 4, that's the orange tip. You can see that early on in the epidemic, in the pandemic, the orange was a very tiny, hardly visible proportion of hospitalizations. But as we've become more and more vaccinated in the older age groups, you can see that the number of children being hospitalized by COVID is growing. And if you float over that high peak in December, it's in the hundreds. It's well over 200 children were vaccinated just in that one time, hospitalized in that one time period. So children being hospitalized is real. Even as you hear rumors that Omicron may be more mild, it's still hospitalizing children and making them sick.
Thanks so much. And this is our next question for Dr. Bojorquez from Andres J. is along that, or completely related. It's basically, also asking how many kids are actually being admitted to hospitals these days because of COVID, and what are you seeing on the ground?
Yeah, thank you. And I agree, Shannon. I will start also by saying I have 3 kids at home, and the first 2 were able to get their vaccines back in that May when the over 12, and my young one who got it when she was 5 was one of the first ones as well. Why? For the same reason that I know that the data shows that they're safe, and I know that the risk is there. So with regards to hospitalization, absolutely, we are seeing kids be hospitalized. And now in the Omicron phase, it's just spreading so quickly that our hospitalizations have actually gone up. And Laurel, if you'll bring up slide 9, it kind of is just going into more detail of what Shannon showed. So it's a perfect follow-up. What I wanted to highlight on this slide is what we're
seeing. Just one second. Sorry, I'm a little.
Yeah.
Wait, was this your?
That's mine.
No, that's yours.
Shannon's.
Okay. And then
what else? Set up on the slide as you're bringing it up is that this here shows in the 12 to 17, which is of course more data that we have given the time that we're following this. And if you can't find it, that's okay.
It'll just take 1 second. It's doing something weird. We have them now, I think, almost.
Great. That what we're finding right now is the majority of people being hospitalized are the unvaccinated. So now we are really seeing the protection of the vaccine, how it's preventing hospitalization, how it's preventing severe disease. We're still seeing it spread. People still get COVID-19, people still spread it, but the vaccine has just amazing protection. And let's see if we can get it.
I'm so sorry. I'm going to have to just quickly re-upload this for some reason, but it'll just take a moment. So we'll have them back shortly.
Yeah, what we've seen, and of course our data is limited by who reports it. So as you can imagine, we don't have the same reporting going on in all the states, but in our 5 to 11-year-olds, what we know is we've had 1.9 million cases of COVID infections. And of those, we've had 8,300 hospitalizations. So we are seeing lots of hospitalizations happening. Thank you. On this slide, let me just orient you here. So what we see here, this is for the 12 to 17-year-olds from June to December 2021. The green line is those that are fully vaccinated that have been hospitalized per 100,000 in our population. And the blue line, if you see it continuously to go up, is the rate in unvaccinated persons, 12 to 17-year-old, in our rate per 100,000. So you don't need to see much more than just see that very, very difference of how well our vaccines are working and protecting against hospitalization. The other thing that I just want to mention that we see is what's called MIS-C, multi-system inflammatory syndrome in children. This is one of the complications that we see in our young kids with COVID. And what it is just as the name says, multi-system inflammatory syndrome. So you see inflammation in all different organs. We're seeing inflammation in the heart, the lungs, the kidneys, the brain, the skin. So this comes as a complication of COVID, and you can get high fevers, you can get really bad belly pain, rashes, and they end up in the hospital, and it can be quite significant. And that rate has gone up. I had checked earlier on our stats, and we were something like over 2,000 cases of MIS-C in kids 5 to 11. Now we're up to over 6,000 cases of this. So yes, overall kids do well with it, but the significant risk of significant unfortunate disease and even death is there. So the last statistic that I found was we had almost 100 deaths in the 5 to 11-year-olds as a result of COVID with these significant complications.
That's such an important way to start this program, I think, because so many of the questions that we get from parents are kind of about them trying to balance risk or think about risk differently. So this is a important, just definitive reminder that like really here is what is like getting vaccinated is across the board. It's not really a balance, is it? Like it's not really a compromise. It's just a very clear cut. This is the way to be safe. Okay.
Not even close.
Yeah. Our next question, we'll start this one with Shannon, is from Abigail T, who writes, first we had vaccines for 18 over, then 12 to 15, now 5 to 11. I don't understand what causes delays in making vaccines for young children.
Yeah, this is a great question. I think everybody that has children is really ready to embrace this vaccine as the best way to protect our loved ones from disease and death that can potentially be lifelong debilitating disease. It's frustrating, and I get it. I hear you. So, vaccines, many vaccines, and this vaccine in particular, the suite of vaccines, were evaluated not to block infection, but to block or mitigate disease. And so, and that's typical of most vaccines. It's very difficult to completely block. It was just kind of a bonus cherry on top that the initial vaccines did that to some extent at the beginning before our, it's a bit of a moving target, right? But they were always evaluated for their efficacy at blocking disease or mitigating disease. And so when the clinical trials first started, in the late spring of 2020, they focused on at-risk groups that we already knew there were certain age groups. So it was basically focused on 18 and up, and for scope logistics, it couldn't include a lot of other factors like pregnant women. A lot of my pregnant friends and colleagues are like, why didn't they include pregnant women in the initial trials? Now it's showing that pregnant women, it's critically important to get pregnant women vaccinated. They're at particularly high risk of COVID disease, and the fetus as well. So wouldn't it have been great if the scope of those original clinical trials to study the vaccine efficacy and safety to block disease, not infection, was more comprehensive? But it has to be staged. So the timing really is about staging. And so what you basically have to do is you have to roll out the vaccine and the placebo, and then you have to wait for people to get naturally infected, and then you study the efficacy of protection against disease. And so you might imagine that as you go younger and younger in your age cohorts, and you're dealing with populations of children that are already fairly resilient to disease, you need to wait longer and longer to get the sample sizes necessary to really ask whether vaccination for that age group is efficacious. The safety is kind of not the issue. It's how efficacious is the vaccine for the children, given that we have to wait longer to get the data to be able to answer that for sure. And so it's happening that, every time we notch up in the amount of data, we get a new authorization to a different age cohort going younger and younger as more and more data come in.
Great, thank you. Okay. And actually, there's this quick question from Pat I'm going to throw in, who asks, why do we have to vaccinate kids 5+ after they've had the virus? I think that's probably a common one we don't have on our list.
Yeah,
go ahead, Shannon.
No, go, Deanna.
I was just going to mention and this is something, as we were saying, like, this is something we continue to monitor, and we learn more every day. But what we are finding is that actually the longer protection comes from being vaccinated, that you do have some immunity after you get COVID. However, studies are showing us that you have longer protection and better protection if you're vaccinated. Yeah,
and I was going to add that I'm seeing the same data in the primary literature, and also that one potential explanation is that when you get a natural infection, nothing's controlled. The dose, the length of time that you're sick. Whereas, these vaccine trials have calibrated the perfect amount of vaccine to deliver the amount of messenger RNA down to the microgram level to get you that level of 90% protection. So when you're talking about natural infections, you're completely rolling the dice in terms of dose and which organs get involved or exposed, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay.
Variant. Yeah.
Great. Okay. For Diana from Sanjay G, you hear so much about kids having adverse or even worse reactions to the vaccine. How common is that really, and what are you personally seeing?
Yeah, so with side effects, I will say that kids, as Shannon was mentioning, they are really resilient, which is one of the reasons why I enjoy pediatrics so much. The side effects are actually even less in kids from what we're seeing than what we as adults were experiencing. I know that I had really bad sore arm and fatigue. In kids, what we're seeing mostly is the sore arm, some swelling, You may see a little bit of headache and overall fatigue that resolves within 1 or 2 days. I haven't seen it at all impact their ability to continue to go to school or do any of their activities.
Okay, great. That was a pretty straightforward answer, it sounds like.
Yes.
So for Shannon from Perla M, lots of curiosity about just what goes on behind the scenes when a vaccine is created. This question is specifically, how do drug makers decide how much vaccine should go into someone, especially smaller bodies of children? And a follow-up, what's actually in it?
Yeah.
Which is, great question.
Yeah. So I should have said at the beginning, the vaccine that's really approved in children is the Pfizer BioNTech. So I'll just focus on that.
Yeah,
good. So actually, it goes back to this discussion around safety and efficacy. And when you're moving a vaccine into a smaller other age groups, even pregnant people, you want to look at both those things, safety and efficacy. When a drug company does a vaccine trial, they actually have a dosing ranging trial built into their their early clinical trials. It's kind of this sort of phase 1 step, and so they chart the landscape of different kinds of dosing in their clinical trial, and then look for both safety and efficacy. And so with the Pfizer vaccine in adults, the sweet point of safety and efficacy for adults is 30 micrograms. And that's been the right, actually the right dose also for the 12 to 15-year-olds and the 16 to 17-year-olds. So that's working. For 5 to 11, when they did that sort of dose ranging trials, they landed on 10 micrograms of messenger RNA. And so this is the actual active ingredient of the vaccine, right? The one and only messenger RNA that gives your immune cells the genetic code to make spike and train your immune system to recognize and react to spike. So the spike protein. So dosing trials, and then it kind of makes sense that for 5 to 11, it is a third of the dose of an adult that they settled upon, and it's probably related to maybe both the fact that they're small, but also the fact that their young immune systems just work better. They're more reactive, they're more efficient, and so 10 micrograms is the right number for them to have a good and long-lasting immune protection. And it turns out that they are as protected, if not a little bit more, than adults. So
that's great to know. And that follow-up question that Perla had about what's actually in the vaccine, which you hear a lot of misinformation about. So good to tackle.
Right. So this mRNA vaccine, that both of them, Moderna as well, they're delivered in fat droplets, and so little tiny nanoparticles of lipid. You could kind of think of them as butter droplets, right? I love butter. So a large so the main active ingredient is messenger RNA, which is just a strand of genetic information like we have in our bodies, same composition, just a different encoding. And then the lipid droplets, so tons of lipids are listed. If you look at the FDA's list they list the ingredients for all the vaccines, a lot of lipids are listed. And then the next major type of ingredient is really just, it's kind of like saline, like, it's made up of the same kind of stuff you would wash your contact lenses with to rinse and put in your eyes. I mean, it's these buffered salts, potassium salts, chloride salts, sodium. It's all these sort of buffering salts to keep the pH balance and act kind of like a saline solution. So that's about it. And then I saw sucrose. I don't know what that's all about, but but there's no eggs. Like the flu vaccine is made in eggs, right? No preservatives. There's no latex. It's actually an incredibly pure and simple and basic and unjunked up formulation. If you pick up anything in your grocery store and you read it off, it's got a lot of the the salts, the same salts, and it's got a lot of other junk like color and who knows and preservative that this doesn't have. It's incredibly simple and safe.
Great. Thank you so much. This one for Diana from Brendan R. I have a 14-year-old and a 3-year-old in the same house. What should I be doing? What should I be worried about or doing to protect them?
Yes. So first, make sure we vaccinate. And as Shannon was mentioning, the vaccine, given the ingredients, there are so few people that cannot get the vaccine. Overall, everybody can. Really, the only contraindication would be if you have an allergy to any of those, which is rare. It happens, but very rare. So absolutely, for the 14-year-old, please go ahead and vaccinate. And if appropriate, make sure you get the booster as well. And then for the 3-year-old, this is what a lot of our families are dealing with, as we've talked about. Unfortunately, right now, we don't have the vaccines yet approved for under 5. So we would go back to the basic, what we know about how to take care of ourselves from this coronavirus. Make sure that you wear your mask when they're going to be indoors. Lots of hand washing. I've seen kids get so much better and so aware of hand washing. We still recommend trying to avoid large indoor gatherings. Better meet friends outside. And if you're going to be close outside, then wear your mask. And if you're sick, if you have any symptom, then maintain your distance, stay home, and get tested. And I'm glad to see that we're getting more availability in testing. So definitely we need to test to stay safe. And, for the 14-year-old, I just want to mention, when you asked about side effects, one of the things that we have, I just want to put this out there, that we have heard is the risk of myocarditis, which is whenever there's the itis means inflammation. So this is inflammation of the heart muscle. And we have seen some reported cases of that. And it tends to be in adolescent males or younger men. But the risk of myocarditis from getting the vaccine, it's always this risk-benefit analysis. The risk of getting myocarditis from the vaccine is significantly less than actually getting myocarditis from COVID. And so there's lots of data that shows this. And it's monitored, right? As Shannon was saying, we continue to monitor this. And all of these cases are being reported. And what we've seen is that those cases that have been reported usually happens within a few days of the vaccine. And they're admitted, we're monitoring them. They recover quickly, and they're back to their regular activities within usually really a few days. So full recovery is what we're seeing as compared to when you do get, unfortunately, myocarditis from either COVID or other viruses. The recovery period is a lot longer. The illness from it is a lot more significant. So again, we look at what is the benefit versus the risks. And for all of our kids, definitely the vaccine is so much more worth than any potential side effect.
Oh, great. That's great. We did actually have a question specifically about that from Rosa. So I'll recognize her question and say, I hope that made you feel a lot better. And okay, thank you. Yes, thank you very, very much for that. We brought up Omicron earlier in the conversation, and people kind of getting a little comfortable with that because it feels they're hearing that it's very mild. So this question from Eliana, I hope I said that right, N, will give us a chance to talk about that more, which I think is important. She wrote, I've read that Omicron is dominant everywhere and that it's very mild. Assuming my child is healthy, what are the risks or benefits of just allowing them to catch it so they can build some immunity?
Great. Well, to the point about Omicron being pretty dominant, I call on this graph that I called proportions of variance in the US. Yeah. So I love to geek out over this data. This is offered on the CDC website where they track the variants, and they're using both their Greek name. You can see Omicron in purple, and Delta. And I love to recognize the lineage name B1.1529 and B1617.2. Anyway, very awkward names. But you can see over time the turnover, sort of the takeover of Delta, which we started really started living with it in the summer and really leaned into it over the fall. And then you can sort of see it coming down. and Omicron rapidly becoming the most common cause of COVID-19 here in the US. And these patterns are really rolling in all over the world, maybe slightly different paces. Sometimes different countries have different reporting infrastructure and timing. But in general, Omicron definitely is kind of taking over. The mechanism underlying that is both was early on recognized as the fact that it is more transmissible than Delta. But there's also been increasingly more recent data to show that it's better than Delta at escaping prior immunity, whether that immunity is natural or vaccine acquired. But I really think the meat of your question is this question of whether it's mild. So it's more transmissible. It's a bit of an immune escapant. Is it more mild? We actually don't have enough data to say that it's more mild. And I think you've already seen some data coming from Deanna's work and from the publicly available data now showing that there are still plenty of hospitalizations, death, and severe disease. And the data that when people say mild, what they're really talking about is what's happening in a population of vaccinated people. And so like the early data coming out of South Africa that said, oh, it's more mild, it was because it was the hospitalization rates were mitigated by vaccination, as well up in the mid 40s for that country at the time. And then they had a huge exposure, a huge wave of Delta come through. So there's a lot of standing immunity. So when people say Omicron is mild, it's mild in a highly vaccinated population. It's not, and you also have to control for age. And so the South Africa data showed that more 30-year-olds were being hospitalized in the Omicron wave versus more 50-year-olds hospitalized in the Delta wave. And that's probably because of, who survived and came through the earlier waves. So actually, if you want to go back a slide, I'm sorry, I do want to talk about that. Okay. So this is trying to understand the rate at which people become hospitalized at a population level, and they looked at those two waves, the Omicron wave most recently and the Delta wave earlier in the fall. And so this is a population level cut. So they didn't go back and confirm whether these individuals had Delta versus Omicron, and you saw that turnover. But definitely, and they broke it out by age, which is also a big factor in whether you become hospitalized. And so just to say that it's way too complicated and way to control all the variables and way too early to say that Omicron is less virulent. But it does appear to, in these studies, to be maybe almost or at least half as severe as Delta. So if you control for everything and given all the caveats I just said, which we don't really know what those individuals are infected with, it does appear to be at least half as dangerous. I am not willing to live with those risks of that's still not mild enough, in rabbit ear quotes, for me to risk exposing my child to it. And in addition, it's as we've already talked about, natural immunity is a huge gamble. We don't know whether it will be. In fact, we know that it's not as effective and lasting as the vaccine. Mm-hmm. So if you go to the next slide, this was a recent study that looked at a population in a community and broke it down by age. And I have two slides. One is the proportion of infections by age and by variant. And then this one is the admission rate. And so if you go back a slide, you can see that we're talking about our youngest people, right? And so the orange bar is the 5 to 17-year-olds. And then under 5 is the very small blue portion at the very bottom, the dark blue. And what I want to show you is that the fatness of both the blue and the orange is getting bigger with Delta and Omicron. Now, at a population level, that's probably because they're the last folks standing, right? They're the ones that aren't vaccinated. So probably they're going to make up more of a proportion, but they're still being hospitalized. They're still getting infected. And people are still seeing severe Omicron-caused disease in children in hospitals and death. And so then if you go to the next slide, it shows you the admission rate. And Omicron is the bright yellow color, and you can see that huge peak of actual hospitalizations in the 0 to 4. It's huge compared to the other variants. Mm-hmm. So this is not a gamble that I would advise taking.
Thank you so much. Okay. And for Diana, let's turn back to, it's so great to have you on in part because people have so many questions about things they've heard. My child could get this, or will they get this? And you addressed Rosa, who was worried about her teenage son getting myocarditis earlier. We did have another question, and I'm so sorry I didn't capture the name of the person who asked this, but they were essentially asking, is it true that the vaccine could affect my daughter's long-term fertility? Is that something that you've heard or that you get questions about?
It is definitely a concern that we've heard a lot from a lot of our parents. And I'm so relieved to share with you that there is no data that supports anything like that. So we haven't seen it affect at all fertility. It doesn't affect your menstrual cycles. In fact, what we have found is for our pregnant people, we want to make sure we protect them because they are at increased risk for severe disease. So no, it doesn't affect fertility. It won't affect anything having to do with your menstrual cycle either.
Fantastic. Are there any other kind of like rumors or things you get commonly asked specific to side effects that we should address now? And I those are the two I've heard most. So, but I thought we should check.
Yeah. So one of them, I think, and Shannon was getting to it, the idea that if I get this mRNA vaccine, it's going to change my own DNA. It doesn't work like that. So thank you, Shannon, for talking about that. So really this vaccine is amazing, and it's really built on a lot of research, right? And it seems like to a lot of people like, whoa, this happened way too fast. They don't know anything about this. Actually, it's been studied for a long time. And I think that one of the reasons why we're able to get through some of those stages that Shannon was talking about is because it was so prevalent in the community that we could get the data in a much timelier way than with other vaccines. So a lot of that, of what you said, is it going to affect my DNA? I don't know what is in the vaccine. How am I going to give my child something that I don't know? And actually, we know exactly what's in the vaccine. As Shannon said, the ingredients are very, very, very limited, actually, and it is a very pure vaccine. And then, of course, the risk for the myocarditis that we talked about. The other thing I was going to mention, if I can just take a moment, that even though we're seeing, right, and what people are saying, Omicron being so mild in kids, and if it is mild, why do I have to vaccinate my kids? I also think we have to really call out the impact that even a COVID diagnosis is having, right? We just came out of a period where we were isolating our kids at home. All of us were quarantining. The amount of the effect, particularly on our kids, on mental health distress, is huge. And any diagnosis nowadays, right? You are, again, absent from school. You isolate. We have to isolate from their friends, from really such a big impact that it's had on the mental health of our kids. So one more reason why, as soon as you can, to vaccinate so that we can continue to have our kids in school and that they can take advantage of all of that socialization that really has been, unfortunately, limited in the past 2 years.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Do you see, Diana, parents or families or caretakers fears starting to calm overall? I know you do so much work to address vaccine hesitancy as well, and I just wonder trend-wise if you think we're getting to a good place or if you are still haunted at night by how much further we have to go.
It's a both. It's an and. Yes, I do think that thanks to a lot of the science that we, people they trust professionals, they trust their doctors, of us encouraging it, talking about it, answering their fears, trying to figure out what it is that makes them hesitant is helpful. Mm-hmm. I think that the precautions that schools have taken have helped a lot. All the mitigation strategies or protocols. And I know at times that myself as a parent, it seems overwhelming, but it's really, they're all there just to keep our kids safe, to keep our teachers safe, so that we could continue to send our kids to school. Thinking back to when schools were closed, I mean, right, all of us can relate to the stress that it had, not only on us, but really on our kids. So I do think that we are getting better. And I'm always so grateful that particularly here where we are, we have high vaccine rates, and people overall are very respectful of the recommendations.
Great. And I know just to that mention of how pure the vaccine is, Mindy and several others actually commented how reassuring it was just to hear you all talk through what's actually in it, and that it is quite simple and just make that easier to understand. One thing that we're also seeing a lot in comments from Evan and others is and this one specifically from Cam that we captured earlier, questions about what we know or are learning about getting COVID more than once, about the effects of long COVID being, especially Cam pointed out, he's read that it's been linked to cognitive impairment. And what do we know about those things? And do we know anything specific for children yet?
Yeah. So I want to just circle back to something Deanna said about the sort of the risks, and there are risks that we know and can measure, like hospitalization, death, myocarditis, and in all cases, the known risks for vaccination versus getting COVID is so much more overwhelmingly in favor of getting vaccinated, even for things like myocarditis and pericarditis. Then there's the emerging risks, like a positive diagnosis, putting a child back into isolation and disturbing their mental health, disrupting their learning and their socialization, their development. Those are emerging, measurable, known risks that are coming out of getting COVID. And now we're starting to also see, as time goes on, we can start to get a handle on long COVID, and that we're starting to be able to measure also. And we can ask questions about what it is, what are the correlates of it, and how does vaccine protect you, and how are different age groups impacted. And so I was read a very recent paper that this is Omicron hasn't been on the scene quite long enough to really nail down the long COVID question, because long COVID is really defined as symptoms 4 weeks or later, but there's a real peak at 12 weeks and beyond. So there's been a recent study and so this is focused on Delta, because we haven't quite lived with Omicron long enough. But there's some initial data showing that, yes, Omicron can also be related to long COVID. But long COVID is basically something that happens in up to 30% of people, whether or not they're hospitalized. If you never even got severe enough to go to the hospital, you can still develop long COVID. The hallmarks of long COVID, the primary, 1 in 3 people with long COVID experiences fatigue, and 1 in 5 people with long COVID, it's expressing itself as cognitive impairment, and that is freaky.
Yeah.
So as somebody that got chickenpox because there was no vaccine available, I am now looking to get my shingles vaccine. Did we know about shingles when we were dealing with chickenpox? No, there's so many things we don't know about this virus. Do you want to gamble with cognitive impairment in your children and long COVID? 30% long COVID. 1 in 5 of all people that get COVID have cognitive impairment. Like, I can't. Right. Don't mess with my brain, please. Don't. And so, whereas to Deanna's point, the technology, the mRNA vaccine technology, it's been around for 15 years. We know what it does. So the knowns, there's so many more knowns. Mm-hmm. And with coronavirus, there's so many more unknowns, and we're just discovering it all the time.
Well, one thing with long COVID that I think is maybe a source of confusion, because I know I was confused about it. When we say long COVID, I think a lot of people think that means you are positive for COVID for a long time. But what you're actually talking about is you clear it and then have symptoms that continue. Is that right? Is that correct?
That's right. It's called post-COVID sequelae. So it's basically kind of sticking around. The symptoms are persisting. And the rate that there was an amazing review study that looked at long COVID specifically in children and found that 12% of children develop long COVID, infected children. That's another gamble of 7% develop the fatigue and 12% develop cognitive impairment.
Okay. And I'll add here too that any sort of study that we've cited throughout this, we'll go back and add those into a Google Doc that we'll add to the comments so that if you want to learn more or you want to see where a reference came from, that information will be available to you. I have one more pair of questions for each of you, but I think before I do that, I was just, you mentioned something about just other childhood vaccines broadly. And I wondered, Dr. Bojorquez, with, and Shannon as well, if you've seen this, but when you're getting people's questions about the COVID vaccine, are they, does the fact that you can say, like, you've been vaccinated for a lot of other things, as have your children at this point, like, where is that hesitancy specific to COVID coming in? Do you think it's because we didn't know COVID existed a handful of years ago and it just feels, really like the landscape's very scary, or what do you think that is, that it's particularly frightening?
I'll start, and then I'll be very interested, Shannon, to see what you think. I think it's many reasons. I think it's new to us. Going back to the fact that it's an mRNA vaccine, this is right the first time we have this, and it's very new. So of course, as parents, we want to do what's best for our kids. We want to protect them, and I think it's just knowledge, being aware of what we do know, and the fact that this vaccine has now been given to millions and millions of people. And it's to me, it's comforting to be able to tell my patients and their parents that we monitor this. It's not like, okay, it's one and done, we're getting the vaccine to everybody. We continue to monitor it. We continue to learn. And I feel very confident in those systems that are put into place. So we will continue to learn, and if needed, we will adjust. And I think that's also one of the things that is hard for families. They'll tell me, well, back in 2020, this is what CDC was saying, and now they're saying this. And it's because we're learning, and we don't keep it a secret. We absolutely make sure that we are sharing the most up-to-date, the most really effective and based on data. Mm-hmm. So I think a lot of reassurance is needed, and I'm happy to give that, as I always do. I share that my kids were, and as we both shared, like, we were the first ones, like, I'm ready.
Yeah. Right. Thank you so much for that. And let me go ahead and ask our last.
I was going to just.
Oh, sorry, Shannon, go. Yeah.
Just add briefly that I think that what I've been hearing is that a lot of people associate the rapidity of the, bench to bedside of the course of these vaccines and their development and distribution, on the order of 10 months compared to 10 years for the vaccines maybe we took as children. And that, to many people, feels like shortcuts were taken. Like, how can you do it that quickly unless you take shortcuts? But actually, that is not true. No shortcuts were taken. That, as Deanna alluded to before, being in the middle of a pandemic with a huge abundance of natural infections going on allows you to acquire a lot of data real fast. and that's at the key, at the heart of evaluating, is enough data. And then the other phenomenal thing was how much collective resources, brain power, human resources across sectors, science, industry, and money, huge amounts of money and infrastructure to get this going. So it was, the rapidity was because we all dug in, bent our attention and huge amount of resources to get this out, because it's an emergency. It's a It's a global emergency.
Mm-hmm. I think I've heard you talk too about how the response in terms of like the research and the development that happened was historic in how much sharing and collaboration and just open data went around and like that being a very new way for the world to approach a problem very quickly. Is that correct?
It's a huge amount of transparency and crowdsourcing of the data. It's a phenomenal. Country boundaries are completely broken down as we share sequences in real time, and it's a really wonderful time to be a scientist. Unfortunately, it has kind of empowered or enabled a little bit of an infodemic, right? That different people pull information from these open sources, and sometimes they're still in peer review, sometimes they're off the cuff anecdotes, and they don't have quite the data yet to support them. And so unfortunately, the downside of being so completely open source and transparent is that sometimes misinterpretation and infodemic can proceed. But in general, it's a really amazing time.
So just the more information that's out there, the more careful you have to be about verifying where it's actually coming from. Yeah,
exactly.
Okay, so our last audience question for Dr. Bojorquez is from Magda H, who would like to know what the risk of vaccinating kids who are getting cancer treatments or are otherwise immunocompromised.
So for our immunocompromised kids and even adults, right, what we're talking about is even higher risk for severe disease. So it's even more important to get them vaccinated. And what we know is because they're immunocompromised or they're on medicines that suppress their immune system, that they actually do not have the same robust response that somebody else can have. So that is why actually the recommendation for some of these immunocompromised or other chronic conditions is to get 3 doses as their primary. Instead of us getting them, we get 2, that 3 is recommended so that their body can respond. And then on top of that, even a booster. So they're more at risk. They may need even more vaccine to protect them because of their underlying condition. So more important to talk to your doctor, make sure that you do get what's needed to protect them and protect everybody else.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Shannon, we'll start this question with you. But Dr. Bojorquez, you also tell us what you're hearing or seeing in your community. This is from Jennifer L. And she asks, when is the vaccine for kids under 5 coming out? And will there be any additional risks?
Yeah. I want to know too, especially when I see those hospitalizations in the 0 to 4s. So Pfizer has been studying the vaccine in 0 to 4-year-olds for a few months. And I think we were all hoping that by the end of the year, they would have something in authorization, emergency use authorization. But it turns out that they did these studies on a 2-dose regime, similar to the rest of us, a 2-dose primary. And it doesn't seem, it's safe, but it doesn't seem to be immunogenic enough, effective enough, particularly in the 2 to 4-year-olds. And so it seems like the 6-month to 2-year-olds are fine with they're doing a 3 microgram dose of mRNA instead of a 10 microgram dose in the 5 and ups. And for 6 months to 2 years, that seems efficacious. But for 2 to 4 years, it's not giving them enough of an immune response. And so they're going back in, already started doing more clinical trials, this time doing a 3-dose regime. And again, all the safety indicators are there, perfect, very positive, in keeping with the other patterns in the other age groups. But it's not effective enough. So they're going to a 3-dose regime. Pfizer is suggesting that they would be able to have the data submitted to the FDA sometime in the first half of this year, 2022. So unfortunately, we have to wait a little bit longer. Yeah.
And Diana, for people who are kind of confused, like why would 2 to 4s be different? I know just generally that the immune systems can be very different for children and adults. Can you help us understand that a bit better?
I wish I could. It's a good question. I don't think it was expected, right? Which is why, again, this is followed so closely. But yes, just as Shannon said, that they just weren't having the good response that we wanted them to have. And why in the under? I don't know. I hope we learn So I'm also anxiously waiting for those to come out.
Right. Well, I guess the delay is frustrating, but also reassuring, and that, there's always this determination to get it right and be sure that it is going to do what we need it to do. And really, all of the answers throughout this whole program, I think, are unmistakably just get vaccinated, get that for yourself, for your kids, get it done. And so a good way to end, I think, Diana, you have I'll put this slide up now, some options to share for people who are looking to do that now.
Thank you. Yes, I just want to know that many times there's lots of questions that come up. So I wanted to give you 2 resources on kp.org. If you put that in, this is for all our members and non-members. You get lots of useful information, how to get vaccine, how to keep your family safe, what to do if you do get exposed. And then also the CDC just has such wonderful information as well for you all. So please use those 2 links as you need to. And the next slide, when everybody is ready, when you need your vaccine, just to share resources as to where to get your vaccine. I do recommend the mytrin.ca.gov is a great place to start to look for availability. Also as well at kp.org, you can also find places, members and non-members. And then I'm so happy to share that Kaiser Permanente is joining the warriors in trying to also promote both the booster and the vaccines as needed. And on January 29th, we are going to be offering free vaccines around Chase Center at Thrive City. So please take advantage of that to help keep yourself and your family safe.
Wonderful. Thank you. And we have dropped every single link just mentioned in the chat. So those resources are there. We will again follow up with a document of all resources and papers cited in case you want to learn more. And Shannon and Diana, I cannot thank you enough. I know from reading the comments how helpful this has been and reassuring this has been for a lot of people. So I really, really hope it made a difference. And if you asked a question during the stream and you didn't have it answered, keep an eye in the comments. We'll try to work with our 2 guests to loop back and really make sure we're answering everything. But thank you so much for being here. Dr. Bojorquez, you are welcome back anytime. I hope you'll feel free to demand a reappearance. And have a wonderful rest of the day, everyone. We really appreciate you tuning in. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for having me.
This was fun. Bye-bye.